the teachers stay after school, so that's a thing that the public schools probably wouldn't be able to afford. And then we also thought that this one is less about budget and more just about social interactions. But we were thinking that maybe there could be an ELL all-day classroom. So instead of pulling them out into separate classrooms, they would just have those reading levels together all day, so that those students could always be learning English, but they would also be learning content with their ELL teacher, so that if they were struggling, she could help them then. So the issue with this was that you'd be missing conversations with native English speakers and relationships with the other students that could make them feel a little isolated. Okay, so the next question was, how can you effectively design a lesson plan for a diverse set of learners? How does this kind of planning help or take away from education, and what applications can we take away from this? So I'm going to address this question because I was working in the ELL classroom. So working in the ELL specific classroom, the students, even with the same age range, were in a variety of different reading levels. So they might have been 3rd through 5th graders, but they were all, one of them could have been at kindergarten reading level and the other one could have been at, 4th grade. So in order to address this complexity, Ms. Johnson would let the students work mostly on their own, on individual projects. And this allowed for the students to work at their own pace and at their own level. So most of the time, the students would be sitting alone at a desk, working on reading by themselves. In order to break up that time, because I think it was an hour and a half a day that they would be working with her, and that's a long time for that age range to focus. So in order to break up that time, Ms. Johnson would work with all the students, work with the students all at once every about 20 minutes, and she would ask them to say, like, what words had they learned in the last 20 minutes, and did they choose the right book to read, and what did they read about, that kind of thing, so they could check in with their progress throughout the time that they were there. So observing this method of education, I realized that the students were missing key interactions with their peers. Even though they were sharing what words they read and that kind of thing, they weren't really having conversations with each other. I could see that Ms. Johnson knew that interaction was important because she was bringing them together, but she had weighed the consequences and decided that working on their own levels was more important than having interaction, because they did have that in their other classrooms. So what I learned from this was that was the amount of learning we take part in just by having conversations with our peers, which is something we take for granted. Talking to our peers about content that we're learning is really important. And a larger takeaway that I found was that by incorporating lots of people into one task, we can be more efficient and stronger as a team.
So I'll be addressing the next question because I worked one-on-one with one student. So this one was, how does the language barrier experienced by ELL students affect their social lives, and how do they interact with their peers as compared to the peers who are fluent in the English language? So by working closely with Mokshit, I was able to see not only how he worked in the classroom, but obviously how he worked and he interacted with his peers. So obviously the language barrier poses a problem in his social life. And one thing that I noticed, though I don't know how he feels on the inside, but one thing that I noticed was that he would only really conversate, interact with another Indian boy in his class. And I don't know if this is due to his lack of English fluency, but I thought it was definitely noteworthy. So overall, both of us are really glad to have had this experience at Angel. We've been able to address the focus questions that we started with, and we were able to create really great connections with the students that we worked with.
So during my time at Angel, the two things that I started with that made me interested was the Chinese and the volunteering experience. So I wasn't able to use my Chinese as much as I wanted, but just because the students are encouraged to have conversations in English because they're learning English, they're not learning Chinese. Even though the majority of the students I worked with were native Chinese speakers, I used Chinese maybe 3 times. So that was something that sort of let me down, but it was still interesting to see, like, in their dictionaries, the words and then the Chinese translations and that kind of thing. And I found that my experience at Angel and volunteering was similar to other experiences I had at other schools, because I wasn't able to work with one student the whole time. I did have a sort of a stronger relationship with Ishan because I was working with him so much. Like, when he saw me, he would say, "Melanie," and he would run over to me, and it was really cute. But the other kids didn't know me quite as well. So I was glad to have a steady relationship with one kid, and I thought it was really cool to be, even if I didn't have a relationship with the other kids. It was cool to see them from day to day, to see how they made progress and see if, you know, if they're focused one day, maybe they're not focused the next day.
Yeah, I also had a really great experience at Angel. I was able to create a strong connection with one student, which is different than my past volunteering experiences. And I learned a lot about communicating with different people from various backgrounds and how to overcome this language barrier, which I think will definitely help me in my future endeavors. So yeah, thank you for listening, and if you have any questions, yeah.
Do you have any questions?
From an education philosophical perspective, how can we deal with both the social and the academic concerns that you expressed when language appears to be the key? No, the reason I ask it is, you mentioned a couple times that taking them out of the rest of the classroom, they miss science and math. But if language is an issue, can they really understand and study science and math when it's being taught in English?
Yeah.
Okay. So is a higher priority to, as you mentioned at one point, separate them almost from the integration, to have them learn as much as possible English and math in a, you could say, sooner or quicker timetable, so that then they can ultimately learn the rest.
Yeah.
But then you have the argument of, we want to integrate people and have them feel a part of everything, but can they truly feel a part of everything if they can't understand it? So that I don't think there's an answer, but that came to mind. And Baani, in your case, you mentioned work with a kindergartner.
Mm-hmm.
How can an adult figure out whether his immaturity of age is a barrier or his language the barrier?
Yeah.
Were you able to sort of get a sense of when it was one or when another?
Well, I think in his case it was very different because he was 4 years old,
Right.
and that like is under the legal age.
Yeah.
So, just you can tell by the way that he interacts and the way that he handles himself in so many different situations that his immaturity is kind of coming in the way,
Right.
and but with that same, it was a very nuanced thing because he was also trying to adjust from coming from India and that like super.
Well, so it sounds like relatively recently too.
Yeah. And no one was like hitting him, so he
Yeah.
thought, oh wow, I'm having a great time.
Yeah.
A lot of his teachers actually told me that he would be in a class and he'd just start laughing, like he was a slumming life.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I don't know, but I think they made a really great decision with holding him back a year.
Okay, they did. Yeah.
Also, they were probably putting into consideration the fact that he was younger. They're putting him
Yeah.
to school just so he could be around people who are speaking English and
Yeah.
sort of be part of school culture before he actually has to, be learning things on his schedule. And going back to what you were saying
Yeah.
about the social interaction and
Right.
missing content, I think what they have decided is that learning English and reading and writing is really important. So even if you're missing the content, you can always catch up.
Yeah.
I think
Hopefully,
you learn
yeah.
the water cycle like 7 times in education, right? You
You're making
learn
a comment about our
you know,
7th grade.
You might learn a little bit of chemistry in like elementary school, but then you learn it again in
Yeah.
high school. So
Oh, yeah.
even if you're missing some of that content, they might not do well in the tests, which is something that they are thinking about because
Sure.
testing is such an important part of the culture there. They were talking about it a lot. So